According to the Christus Victor theory of the atonement, Christ's death defeated the powers of evil which had held humankind in the dominion. It is a model of the atonement that is dated to the Church Fathers, and it, or the related ransom theory, was the dominant theory of the atonement for 1,000 years, until Anselm of Canterbury supplanted it in the West with his satisfaction theory of atonement. A recent use of the term was the title of Gustaf Aulén's book, first published in 1931 and translated into English by Gabriel Hebert, in which he drew attention back to this classic early church understanding of the atonement. Gustaf Aulén writes in description of Christus Victor, "The work of Christ is first and foremost a victory over the powers which hold mankind in bondage, sin, death, and the devil." Aulén's book, Christus Victor, Atonement Theories. In his book, Aulén identifies three main types of atonement theories. The earliest was what Aulén called the classic view of the atonement, more commonly known as the ransom theory, or since Aulén's work, it is known sometimes as the Christus Victor theory. This is the theory that Adam and Eve made humanity subject to the devil during the fall, and that God, in order to redeem humanity, sent Christ as a ransom or bait, so that the devil, not knowing Christ couldn't die permanently, would kill him, and thus lose all right to humanity following the resurrection. A second theory is the Latin or objective view, more commonly known as satisfaction theory, beginning with Anselmian satisfaction and later developed by Protestants as penal substitution. Some have argued that the penal substitution theory of the atonement was expressed by the early Church Fathers, such as Justin Martyr c. 100–165, Eusebius of Caesarea c. 275–339, and Augustine of Hippo 354–430. A third is the subjective theory, commonly known as the moral influence view, that Christ's passion was an act of exemplary obedience which affects the intentions of those who come to know about it. Structure. Aulén's book consists of a historical study, beginning with the early Church, tracing atonement theories up to the Protestant Reformation. Aulén argues that Christus Victor was the predominant view of the early Church and for the first 1,000 years of Church history, and was supported by nearly every Church Father including Irenaeus, Origen of Alexandria, and Augustine of Hippo, to name a few. A major shift occurred, Aulén says, when Anselm of Canterbury published his Cur Deus Homo around 1097 AD, which marked the point where the predominant understanding of the atonement shifted from the classic view to the satisfaction view in the Roman Catholic Church, and later within Protestantism. The Orthodox Church still holds to the Christus Victor view, based upon their understanding of the atonement put forward by Irenaeus, called recapitulation. Jesus became what we are so that we could become what he is. Aulén's arguments. Aulén argues that theologians have incorrectly concluded that the early Church Fathers held a ransom theory of atonement. Aulén argues that the Church Fathers' theory was not that the crucifixion was the payment of a ransom to the devil, but rather that it represented the liberation of humanity from the bondage of sin, death, and the devil. As the term Christus Victor indicates, the idea of ransom should not be seen in terms of a business transaction, but more in the terms of a rescue, a liberation of humanity from the slavery and sickness of sin. Role of the Trinity. Aulén states that the chief distinction between Christus Victor and the satisfaction view is the contrary emphasis given to the Trinity and the law. The satisfaction view, Aulén claims, contains a divine discontinuity and a legal continuity, while Christus Victor emphasizes a divine continuity and a legal discontinuity. He points to the emerging theology of penance in the Latin Church as the root of Anselm's ideas, particularly in the writings of Saint Cyprian. In Anselm's logical but revolutionary extension of penance theology, God is unable or unwilling to pardon humanity without having his kingship honored by a payment of blood. Since only a man can fulfill mankind's obligations to the law and to God, Christ must become a man in order to offer perfect penance to God. He does this by satisfying the demands of the law for a sinless life and by suffering the wrath of the Father for past sins. Aulén takes exception to this model, arguing that the Incarnation becomes a legal exercise, a piece of a theological equation based on law theories. Aulén goes on to argue that Christus Victor reverses this view by uniting Jesus and his Father during the crucifixion in a subversive condemnation of the unjust powers of darkness. This is followed by the natural emphasis of Christus Victor, the Father's vindication of Jesus in his victorious and bodily resurrection. It should be noted that advocates of the satisfaction view do not agree with Aulén's characterization, arguing that the satisfaction model does not, in fact, create opposition between the Father and the Son. In the view, the divine opposition is only apparent since the Father desires reconciliation with mankind and Jesus willingly offers himself as a penal substitute. By contrast, Christus Victor depicts Christ's sacrifice not as a legal offering to God in order to placate his justice, but as the decisive moment in a war against the powers of darkness, ironically, the law included. Writings of the Church Fathers. Aulén points to the writings of Paul and the Church Fathers as examples of early Christianity's view of the law as an enemy which must be defeated, in order for mankind's salvation to be secured. He seeks to demonstrate that the penance systems of satisfaction theory and penal substitution place an undue emphasis on man's obligation to offer payment to God and on God's obligation to law, instead by suffering a death that, before the law, meant an accursed status. Christ, instead of satisfying an obligation, overthrew the power of the law, since its condemnation of a perfect man was unjust. Furthermore, death, sin, and the devil are overthrown since Jesus' subsequent resurrection breaks the dominion they once held over human life. Since the resurrection is a mark of the Father's favor despite the law's curse on crucified men, the atonement, far from reinforcing the law, deprives and subverts the law of its ability to condemn. Thus God the Father and God the Son are not set at odds by the cross, with the first in the role of judge and the second in the role of sinner, but are united in seeking the downfall of the devil's system of sin, death, and law that enslaves humanity. This view, Aulén maintains, keeps from the errors of penance systems emphasizing law and man, and reveals the unity within the Trinity's redemptive plan and the freedom of the forgiveness shown to us by God through Christ. The Incarnation. Unlike the satisfaction doctrine view of the atonement, which is rooted in the idea of Christ paying the penalty of sin to satisfy the demands of justice, the classic view of the early Church is rooted in the Incarnation and how Christ entered into human misery and wickedness and thus redeemed it. Aulén argues that the Christus Victor view of the atonement is not so much a rational systematic theory as it is a drama, a passion story of God triumphing over the powers and liberating humanity from the bondage of sin. As Gustaf Aulén writes, the work of Christ is first and foremost a victory over the powers which hold mankind in bondage, sin, death, and the devil. Development of the Christus Victor view after Aulén. While largely held only by Orthodox Christians for much of the last 1,000 years, the Christus Victor theory is becoming increasingly popular with both Paleo-Orthodox evangelicals because of its connection to the early Church. fathers, and with liberal Christians and peace churches such as the Anabaptist Mennonites because of its subversive nature, seeing the death of Jesus as an exposure of the cruelty and evil present in the worldly powers that rejected and killed him, and the resurrection as a triumph over these powers. As Marcus Borg writes, the view, the domination system, understood as something much larger than the Roman governor and the temple aristocracy, is responsible for the death of Jesus. The domination system killed Jesus and thereby disclosed its moral bankruptcy and ultimate defeat. The Mennonite theologian J. Denny Weaver, in his book The Non-Violent Atonement, and again recently in his essay The Non-Violent Atonement, Human Violence, Discipleship and God, traces the further development of the Christus Victor theory into the liberation theology of South America, as well as feminist and black theologies of liberation.